Welcome to Vision 360, where we look at cybersecurity from every angle, from technical foundations to executive decision-making and leadership context. I am your host, Matthew Webster. I work with cybersecurity and executive leaders on judgment and decision-making, helping organizations align cyber risk with business reality. My perspective comes from decades of experience in the field, including multiple chief information security officer roles and working directly with leadership teams to strengthen the resilience, communication, and strategic clarity. Today's conversation is going to be a little bit different from some of the other podcasts that are recorded in the past. Instead of moving through a tight set of questions, we're going to treat this a little bit more as a working discussion today, a little bit more back and forth. And the theme we're covering is part of every company, but it's not always spoken about and not always thought about in a systematic fashion. The topic we're going to cover today is doctrine. We'll look at what it means in practice, how it shapes decisions under uncertainty, and why it often matters more than policies or controls when things get stressful. We'll look at where doctrine comes from, how it shows up, how it stays hidden inside organizations, and what it means for cybersecurity leaders who are trying to make good decisions when business priorities, risk, and realities collide. So today, I'm very happy to say we have Christopher Wiseman, who is going to be joining us today. Christopher is a lawyer who works with leaders when compliance, risk, and real-world execution start to clash. He mentors DPOs and executives on moving from check-the-box privacy systems that actually scale, often in the wake of breaches, regulatory pressure, or fast-moving digital transformation. His focus on making privacy a source of clarity and speed and not friction. So I give a very brief background here. Christopher, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Matthew. And just one clarification, because I don't want to get into trouble with the California State Bar. I'm a JD student, not a lawyer quite yet.
Oh,
but I do have 20 years experience in legal operations. So I'm almost there, but not quite yet.
okay.
So I'm a privacy and governance architect who sits at the intersection of cybersecurity, legal ops, compliance, and governance. I started in the U.S. Marine Corps as a landing support specialist, which is basically under combat engineer and logistics. And in the Marine Corps, we really tested doctrine on a very deep level. It's not an abstract idea. It's the framework that allows a 20-year-old on the beach at 0 dark 30 to make the same decision a colonel would make under fire and without a script. So for the past 20 years, I've taken that same mindset into legal operations, data privacy, GRC roles, and most recently, where I designed system security plans, AI and privacy impact assessments, vendor compliance frameworks for complex public sector and enterprise environments. So my work is less about adding more rules and more about exposing the real doctrine that already runs through the organization. What you mentioned is it's either explicit or implicit. It's what actually gets rewarded, what gets ignored, and how that shapes risk decisions long before the policy is written. And today I'm helping CISOs, boards, and governance leaders turn governance theater into governance architecture. We do that by making risk appetite explicit, aligning the cybersecurity doctrine with business doctrine, and building decision frameworks that still work when the plan fails and the clock is ticking.
Fantastic. I think that's a great introduction. And it kind of gets us into something where we should back up just a little bit, because doctrine has a lot of different meanings. And your military background is very relevant to this particular discussion, because doctrine really does show up everywhere. I agree with everything that you're saying, but it's not a common topic that I think many CISOs are diving into. It's not a common topic that I think most business leaders are starting to dive into. It's there, but usually as you use the word implicit, and so I think that quite often it is implied, but it isn't explicit. But when you use the word doctrine, let's break it down to the basics here. What does that mean in practical, real world terms?
So breaking it down very simply, doctrine isn't a rule book. It's the organizational nervous system that tells every person from the newest hire all the way up through the C-suite and the board how to make decisions under uncertainty when the policy manual doesn't have a chapter for what just happened or what you're trying to prevent. So in the Marine Corps, landing support specialist, you learn this very quickly on the beach when you're directing air, sea, rail, truck traffic through a single choke point during an amphibious operation. There's no time to call headquarters and ask for permission. So practically speaking, doctrine is what lets that lance corporal make a routing decision, because the framework for why is already embedded in the mission parameters. And you see this also in the defense industrial complex, where programs that escape the slow gravity of centralized acquisition through mechanisms like OTAs and SBIR pathways, they're able to do that because they operate under a different doctrinal rulebook, one that pushes decision authority downward and keeps team under thresholds where bureaucratic friction would otherwise paralyze them. And corporate doctrine works the same way. It's the codified why behind the what and the how.
Okay, so I've got a general sense of what you're talking about here, because it seems like you've got the why. So a lot, like if you're a Simon Sinek fan, for example, he's got a great book out there called Start with Why. It starts to activate people and they understand and get everybody on that same page. So you talked a little bit about that choke point as well. Did you understand how and how you start to organize things? Talk a little bit more about what doctrine is on a pragmatic, practical level. So, for example, are there certain documents that you're thinking about that start to get people aligned? Because you can go to the internet, you can Google some stuff, and you can get things like, here's the NATO doctrine and some other types of doctrines for how all these different organizations start to coordinate and work together. But what does this actually mean? What is the core of doctrine? Because I really want to get that straight to make sure that people who are not in the military can start to understand a little bit more about what you're talking about.
Sure. And when you talk about those examples of doctrine, what you're talking about is how all these different, very complex components work together. And when you get down to it, you have doctrine, you have rules, policies, procedures, but at the base foundation for all those policies, procedures, and rules is your doctrine. Your doctrine helps navigate uncertainty. It helps you navigate complex decision making, and it helps answer the ambiguities when you find that those rules, the policies, the procedures, as they will inevitably conflict with each other. It gives you a way of adjudicating and triaging those conflicts to understand, okay, going back to the basics of why, now we know how to judge which direction to go at a decision point where you have two conflicting policies and there isn't a clear right or wrong answer. A great example is working with data flows. You can have international data flows going across to Europe and within the United States, and you're going to find that you have policies on GDPR and you have policies on CCPA. Well, there are going to be some conflicts. And what doctrine allows you to do is to very quickly identify what are the priorities in resolving these conflicts, rather than having to go back and redo policies over and over again. You need to be able to manage that uncertainty when velocity demands it. And doctrine is the underlying foundation that gives you the flexibility to identify and have a common discussion about the trade-offs and the risk appetite when those different policies or procedures conflict.
So I'm getting a closer sense of it. I'm also trying to keep in mind how other CISOs start to work and going. So I'm digging deep into my history,
Sure.
deep into my past to kind of understand that as well. And so there's a lot of different approaches to policies and procedures. I don't want to dive too deep into them, But for example, one of the philosophies that's out there, I'm not saying this is right or the only method, but you have the policy as your why, the standard is going to be the what, and the procedure is going to be the how. When I have written policies, you might say, well, we do this to meet certain criteria. We do this because we have to do it for compliance reason. It's a best practice. All of those sorts of things that go into that. So let's start there at that particular level. Is that part of what you would consider a why if you held that particular philosophy of what a policy is?
So I see it a little differently.
Sure.
I break it down into your doctrine, rules, policy, and procedure. The rules tell you what to do, the policies tell you what not to do, the procedures tell you how to do it. But at the core, you need that doctrine to understand, why are we even making these decisions in the first place? What are our core values, our core mission as an organization that will drive the creation and the execution of the rules, policies, and procedures in the first place? And if you have to answer the question of why we're even doing any of this, it gives you a lot more clarity when those times of uncertainty come to say, okay, at the heart of this, we have a core mission to protect customer data. We have a core mission to provide XYZ services. And we have a core responsibility to our shareholders and our board requirements. And a lot of times, things that CISO are challenged with is explaining to those board levels, those executive levels, why the policies and procedures are crafted the way they are, how they align with the business and operational goals of the organization. And the doctrine, being able to reference the doctrine as a common starting point. Your doctrine is basically a Rosetta Stone in your organization. And everything can be translated when things go well. Everything can be translated and related back to the doctrine. And the doctrine says these are our core fundamental priorities and values. And when there is misalignment, that is a signal that either we need to revisit the doctrine to make sure the doctrine isn't stale, or it means that we need to resolve a conflict between our decision making and execution when it comes to those policies and procedures and rules.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from you, if I can back up and re-explain that, doctrine should be a written document that is, you might have multiple documents, that is separate from your policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. And you also talked a little bit about risk appetite. I know there's risk tolerance and risk appetite, and there's a bunch of other things you could dive into from a risk perspective, but which can and create doctrine on their own, because you start to define that, that can become your why. Let's say if you say your website, it has a certain value, and then you start to ascribe a value in that tolerance and risk tolerance and risk appetite, that can start to become doctrine as well. So what do you see as that relationship between these different types of documents, or is just one of the types of documents going to be determining your risk criteria, such as tolerance and appetite?
Well, one of the critical elements of doctrine, and going back to the military context for a minute, you develop doctrine with the Joint Chiefs. And that means that each branch is represented at that table, and in the corporate environment, that is a representation of your business, different business units, different organizations within your company. So you've got IT, you've got legal, you've got HR, finance. And the doctrine is the common language that you all speak. And so as long as that cross-functional approach is taken and you have a common understanding, when you develop your own policies, procedures, and subsequent doctrines underneath that layer, as long as they're subordinate to the overarching doctrine, you're fine. But again, one of the challenges is if you are just leaving your doctrine implicit and no one quite knows what it means, then it will mean something different to everyone within your organization. And then people start to lock down their own definitions, which may work for that particular business unit. But what happens when you get competing issues between business units? How do you resolve it? Well, you have a problem arbitrating that because you're not operating from a common doctrine to begin with.
And there's also some challenges there because you talked a little bit about language, which is a very core problem, especially when you consider IT, when you consider cybersecurity. The language is very different between those. And that's a big barrier because even if you talk about risk, for example, you go to a CFO has a very different definition of risk than what's often found in cybersecurity. Even a lot of the Fortune 100 companies, for example, they're still using low, moderate, and high. We use the old school risk registers to try to determine things. And then sometimes they'll start to add in some other things that are in there, and they will start sometimes up at the very top. But that language is a massive barrier to creating, in this context, we're talking about doctrine. So
Absolutely.
I'd like to understand how you see that interplay and how organizations can do that and get beyond and create that sort of common language. Because what it sounds like when you're working within the context you're looking at creating a risk culture. If you're using risk tolerance and appetite and those types of things, and you start to ascribe it to specific systems in order to create that. But that culture seems to be part of what you're doing with doctrine.
Absolutely. The language, the commonality of language, the clear communication, that is absolutely fundamental, because without that, all of the other efforts will eventually fall apart. And what I've learned over my experience is that you really need someone involved who is spearheading this effort on doctrine, who can speak multilingually. In other words, within a business organization, every unit has their own frameworks, their own vision, their own way of seeing things, their own jargon, their own understanding of their mission within the company. And rightly so. That's why they're divided that way. But when you're trying to develop an overarching framework of a doctrine, you need to be able to translate those different business imperatives so that everyone has a common understanding of coming together and understanding a shared interpretation of what that doctrine means, not just for the individual business units, but for the organization as a whole and how they interact with each other.
Sure. And so how fluid do you see doctrine? Like, for example, companies go through all kinds of things. Let's say that there's some situation that's going on, all of a sudden the economy's going down and happens to hit their industry very hard. When you talk about things like risk tolerance and risk appetite, that can change drastically based on the context that businesses are in. Because all of a sudden, when you're in really lean times, your doctrine has to change. Would that be an accurate assessment, or would you see things a little bit differently?
I would say that's a signal to reevaluate your doctrine, not necessarily change it. All the input you get is feedback on your doctrine. And when your feedback is non-conflicting policies and procedures, non-conflicting outcomes, that means your doctrine is on very solid ground. It's operating as intended. When you start getting failures, those are signals, be it from the market, from external customers, or internal customers, that something is amiss. And it may be something as simple as tweaking your policies, or it may mean a deeper discussion about the doctrine and whether it's time to review and revise it. And what's important is that this can't just be from the CEO imposing a doctrinal change on the entire organization. It has to be an organic, participatory process where those different voices are getting elevated. The CEO is getting the feedback he or she needs to really understand where are the friction points and where on our scale does it need to be changed. And so you don't want to just willy-nilly change doctrine every quarter because you're trying to game the system. That's not going to work for you. But you don't want it to be so inflexible to where it will never change. It's set in stone and consequences be damned. You're going to stick with it no matter what.
Sure. And like, so for example, typically, and there's lots of reasons for exceptions for this, but typically you want to reevaluate your risk tolerance and risk appetite statements on a yearly basis, just to take a look at them. Obviously, there are emergencies, things can come up, but that's one way that doctrine can change. Would you go along with that particular definition, or what are some challenges you would see with a perspective like that?
Well, I would accept that it's a good place for signals. And it may be because you have an extraordinarily bizarre year because of external circumstances. 2008 housing bubble burst. That's going to send a lot of signals back to your organization. But does that mean that your organization's doctrine on its own is unsound? Or is it just that doctrine demands that we now reevaluate our risk tolerance? So I would kind of put it the reverse, that you need to have a doctrine that states, yes, you want to annually reevaluate risk because that risk impacts how we're able to deliver on our core mission, and it impacts whether our core values are being expressed in how we operate. And, you know, one of the challenges is when the doctrine is unclear or outdated or internally inconsistent, you get one of three outcomes, and they're all catastrophic. You can get paralysis where nobody moves because nobody knows who has the authority. You get rogue action where individuals improvise without guardrails, or you get theater where everybody says they're performing compliance without actually producing safety and resiliency in your organization. And I've seen all three.
Sure. It kind of brings up an interesting notion as I stop and think about it to a certain degree here as well. Because what I'm seeing is, from the way that you're talking about it, it is a little bit like building a culture and building a culture properly because of the amount of work that you need to get into. Now, typically speaking, you talk about, let's say, a company needs to reduce staff or whatever. Usually it's going to be the senior leaders that are going to be making some of those decisions. It's good to get everybody's buy-in. You can't just say, here's my value and here's what our company values and this is the way it's going to be, because you say that, you may be creating theater. I've actually seen that in organizations where they will go through and talk about a value that they themselves don't meet, but they think that they're meeting. You know, so there's a lot of psychology that starts to dive into what you're talking about, but it does create for a much healthier environment. But that can quickly degrade into, you know, conversation chaos as you start to go off into all these little strategies. So if you're trying to create a nice balance for an organization, you're trying to understand, knowing that you can't get every single person involved in a conversation. You're not going to go get the cleaning person involved in doctrinal discussions about IT. Where do you draw the line when it comes to doctrine? Because to me, you've got the policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines, but then you also need the doctrinal policy, the thing that says the why, the what's going on, and what are the core standards and practices that we follow. How do you start to work with something like that? Because it seems like it's an extra burden, and a lot of organizations are not going to want to go down. Like, a lot of organizations don't even like policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. So to write up a doctrine, it's yet another piece of paperwork that you're going to get a lot of pushback on. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, how all those things fit together and what you see as the appropriate direction to go when considering doctrine for an organization.
You know, that's a really tough conversation to have because a lot of the benefits are not well recognized, and it's not a concept that really is understood well outside of very specific sectors such as the military. And the challenge is to help leaders understand why it is so important. So again, the why behind the why is the critical discussion that you have to have with your sponsors, with your C-suite, because if they don't understand the potential business aspect, the ROI on the investment in developing a doctrine, it's all conceptual. It's a great conversation, but it will never launch. So you really have to understand what are the friction points within that organization where doctrine would address them and create a stable long-term solution. Because doctrine is not just another fad. It's not just another business book, from 2025 that says, oh, out now everyone needs doctrine. That's not the right approach because it won't be long lasting. You won't get the kind of buy-in that you need in order to really develop it on a foundational level. So it means asking a lot of questions. It means having some very uncomfortable conversations. And not every organization is going to be open to that. They don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the resources, the time, their board doesn't see the value. Whatever the challenges are, they're not insurmountable, but it really falls back on the legal axiom of it depends. Every organization is different. You're not going to find a single one that is operating under the exact same constraints and the exact same challenges. So you really have to find people that are open to developing tools that will foundationally improve their organization, not just improve around the margins.
Sure. And that's going to be very challenging too, because I could see a lot of people, especially, and we've spoken about this in the past, when you deal with individuals such as Dark Triad, they're going to want to block that. They don't necessarily want to have that because they want the freedom to be able to manipulate the situation around the things that they're trying to do. Doctrine does try to help deal with some of those, but some of the other things too, like from a CISO perspective, one of the things that becomes incredibly important from my perspective, and it's sort of an implied business case, that the CISO should be part of the formation of doctrine. They've got to be more involved in the business, hear the business story, understand the business context, and be able to explain that business context and be able to work with others to put it in a way, in a language that makes sense for the people on the security team. Because all this stuff is going to start to flow down and affect the rest of the organization.
Absolutely. And you're touching on something very important that also comes from the military side of things, and that's the absence of shared intent. In the Marine Corps, every operation begins with a commander's intent statement, which is basically 2 or 3 sentences that tells every person in the unit what success looks like, why it matters, so they can make decisions without waiting for orders when conditions change. And for a CISO, that is incredibly important to have an intent statement that they know has been blessed from the board, from the CEO, that they can rely on to make those independent decisions within their area of authority. And when you talk about developing doctrine, that is both an upwards and a downward signal that the commander's intent or the CEO's intent is spread downward to the CISO, and then the CISO, through a developed doctrine, can then send signals back up to the CEO that says, hey, you said A, B, and C when you instructed us. We've developed across the organization this doctrine to support that, to embed and codify that intent. And now we're seeing some conflicts that need to be resolved. And this is how we recommend resolving it. This is how within the organization we can address this risk, but we need to make sure that we have your underlying blessing that when those challenges occur, we can make those very quick decisions so that we're not waiting in the middle of a possible breach at 2 a.m. when you're traveling out of country to respond in a way that is consistent with how we've developed this internal doctrine.
So let me jump in there and provide a practical example for CISOs. Because let's say the CEO says, we need this out. This is critical for our business. We need these brand new systems installed. It's going to be a new website. This is going to be fantastic. They could say something like, it's going to be secure, but the interpretation of that. So one organization I'm aware of, I won't say any more than that, they had decided that sufficient was, well, we're going to air gap it as much as possible, reasonably possible. And they didn't have antivirus on any of the servers. They had, other things that are set in place. That sends alarm bells for any cybersecurity professional. That should send an alarm bell up that this is the way things are setting up. And that was perfectly secure. I happen to know that the CISO felt the same way too of that specific organization. So when you talk about these things, there are a lot of subcontext, and it is so difficult for a CEO or CFO or some others to really understand what is secure. It's going to be dependent a little bit on the interpretation of the people within the organization. And you could say, yeah, so like from a military background, I've done a lot of FISMA. I've done the DISA-STIGs. For those who are not familiar with it, it's the Defense Information Systems Agency Secure Technical Implementation Guide. They're very tough to do. They're very specific requirements. But if those requirements aren't there, people are going to come up with their own interpretation of what's reasonable and what's not reasonable under the context. Even I've made that judgment call many times in many different organizations. For example, a website that had 0 data on it and they didn't care if it went down for a week and we got the buy-in from the business that was true. You know what? I said, let's go with CIS level 1 hardening. That's it. We don't need to have the DISA-STIGs. We don't need, and that was a good business call. And actually everybody said, thank you for not going crazy on it and requiring the DISA-STIGs, even for something that wasn't that valuable from a business standpoint. But that is a real source of conflict for organizations who don't know how to define it. And I could see in some contexts where, it could be, there's no antivirus on the servers. Let's just let it go.
Right,
So
right.
how do you start to work out some of those things within a doctrinal boundary? Because like in the military and doing the DISA-STIGs, for those who are not familiar with them, you read through that, doctrine is built into the DISA-STIGs themselves. You understand who's reporting to, who is this, how is this stuff, and you can get a sense of what the military hierarchy is actually like by reading the DISA-STIGs. Now, that is not built into most standards and guidelines and policies and procedures and all that kind of stuff within corporate documents to say, this is our minimal standard, this is our moderate standard, and this is our high standard. And the reality is most cybersecurity frameworks are not that mature, with some exceptions in some areas. I don't want to say all, but when you're talking about a large group of organizations, that simply is not true. So how do you start to deal with some of those things from a doctrinal standpoint without going overboard and creating a massive number of documents to start juggling, and then people get lost?
That's a great question. And I just want to go back and touch on something you said. And I'm going to make some assumptions here, but I think
Sure.
they're pretty safe to make. When you were having that discussion, you had a deep understanding about what the company goals were, what the organizational mission was, and how to multilingually translate that between the different business units in order for you to get the approval and the buy-in to say, yes, you know what, we are actually okay if the website goes down for a week. So the collision point is almost always risk appetite. And the problem is that most organizations, as you said, never make their risk appetite explicit. And cybersecurity doctrine says assume breach, zero trust, least privilege. Business doctrine says move fast, minimize customer friction, trust your partners. Now, these two doctrines are not inherently incompatible, but when the business doctrine is implicit and the cybersecurity expectations are explicit, the explicit doctrine always loses. And I've seen this pattern in defense and corporate environments alike. Enforcement is the weak link. Government is historically poor in enforcing values. For instance, the FCPA, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, exists, but prosecutions of major contractors are rare. Fines become a cost of doing business, not a deterrent. And the corporate equivalent is the CISO who documents every risk, presents it to the board, gets acknowledged, and then watches the business proceed exactly as planned. So the collision isn't between security and speed, it's between the organization's stated risk tolerance and its actual risk tolerance. And that's a doctrine problem, it's not a tech problem.
I see. So it basically boils down to the risk tolerance and appetite, if I'm understanding you properly. And it's always misstated because people want to think that. Because that's the interesting thing, though, when you talk about tolerance and appetite. Like a human appetite, it's going to change. Did I just eat an hour ago? Have I not eaten for 6 hours and I went through a lot of exercise? Your appetite, you're going to be ravenous, underneath those if you haven't eaten for 6 hours and you did a lot of exercise. And so just like real world appetite, your risk appetite really does change depending on the context. And that's
Absolutely.
not always something that's acknowledged within organizations. So you can put those in there. You can say, hey, we've got a deviation, but that deviation may or may not be appropriate, and that's where it takes into account. But I also think there's another level of communication problem. Because like you say, hey, let's just document it. You come up with this huge list of stuff. You've got this risk register. Risk registers are okay, but they're not great from a decision-making standpoint. If you go traditional risk register.
It's a documented artifact that doesn't answer the why. And
Right.
That's the importance of the doctrine that underpins those risk registers is the doctrine will inform the why. The register provides an example. It shows you, okay, here is the posture. Here is a snapshot of where we are. And it really reminds me of, the great economist Thomas Sowell, who says, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And that the first question you need to ask is compared to what?
Sure. And that's part of what I think makes the great CISOs is they're going to talk about those trade-offs. They're going to understand what that risk is and be able to communicate that effectively. I'm going to go back to that point that I made that there's a lot of companies out there that are still using low, moderate, and high as a measure of risk. And that doesn't really mean anything from a cybersecurity standpoint. We also put ourselves in a little bit of a pickle as well, because we use stuff like CVEs, common vulnerability exposures. And with that CVE, you might say, oh, it's a critical risk. Is it a critical business risk, though? Is it? Sometimes that answer is yes. But a large portion of the time, that answer is no. And we're not really answering those kind of questions. And that creates additional problems from a cybersecurity standpoint. That becomes a point of translation problems between cybersecurity and business. And so I see that can be a possible area where those two can collide. And the question is, who's going to be right underneath those circumstances? Because, the business is going to get annoyed at cybersecurity because we've got to get this done now. And it may not be the most important thing to focus on. I'll let you speak. I see you have a couple of ideas on your mind.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the kind of really unfiltered truth is that the doctrine that wins is almost always the one with the budget behind it. And I don't say that to mean to be cynical. It's a structural issue. For example, with Pentagon procurement, lobbyists and special interests push programs forward, companies jump in, and the next thing you know, you've got $1 trillion per aircraft commitment like the F-35. And it's taken on momentum that no single governance framework can redirect once the spending reaches critical mass. And so the people who control the funding stream control the operational doctrine, regardless of what the formal doctrine says. And in corporate environments, those same exact physics apply. The CISO can present the most rigorous risk framework imaginable, but if the CFO, the CRO that control the resource allocation, the business doctrine wins every time the two conflict. And this is why really long-lasting implemented governance that is built in and doctrine that is built into the operation demands that governance leaders have a seat at the resource allocation table, not just the risk committee. In the Marine Corps, this is resolved by embedding doctrine into the planning process from the beginning. Every logistics plan accounted for security and throughput simultaneously. You don't bolt security onto logistics after the fact. The corporate environment equivalent is embedding privacy, embedding security into product design, inserting governance into decision-making flows, not as a review gate, but as a design requirement. And while I've put the onus on the practitioners, the CISOs, the compliance people to be multilingual, there's also something that needs to be said for your executives, for your boards, that very high level briefings will never support doctrinal changes at the foundation. And there is a commensurate responsibility for the board members and the executives to really thoroughly understand the doctrine. And once they've given it its blessing, they have to make sure that when doctrinal questions are raised from your CISOs, from your privacy, compliance, legal teams, that really has to be taken seriously. And they really do need to have a seat at the finance resource allocation level, because those discussions aren't necessarily need to have that voice there if you are going to have a thorough, consistent doctrine throughout your decision-making process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it implied in that argument, once again, is CISOs need to be involved in the business discussion, just like every member of the executive team. Because you're right, that's a big problem. If you can't be there as part of the resource allocation, you're out. I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense. And I am aware that a lot of businesses, things end up costing a lot more than expected. They're cost overruns, and that can also affect the amount of resources that you have to get things done, and that's going to put business challenges in. But also from a business trade-off perspective, that's one of the areas I think that a lot of times CISOs don't have visibility into. They don't understand all the trade-offs. So sometimes they get a little squirrely simply because the trade-off isn't there, and they take it in a negative way, and it may or may not be negative. I'm not here ascribing anything to a particular situation. But that ends up being a big challenge, because then you start to create people that are, further and further away from the government. It creates a silo in and of itself, where that sort of, use the French term ressentiment or resentment, gets to be a bit of a problem for organizations and for CISOs, because it does start to pull things apart very quickly. And I think a lot of people aren't looking at the larger psychological aspects of the business and how a lot of these parts fit together. Because you're right, I do think that doctrine is very important, but it also means that people need to be talking. And that means stepping outside of the silos that they're in and learning other languages. That means that you need diverse leadership, very, very diverse leadership.
Absolutely. And, coming from the legal compliance side, I took it upon myself to really try to understand the operational and technology issues that the IT teams, that the CISOs deal with, because I don't want it to become just compliance governance checkboxes and which basically is theater. And someone in your organization, I've found that typically legal and compliance has they are sometimes the people best equipped to bridge the different business units, because ultimately at the end of the day, legal and compliance are responsible for all the legal and compliance obligations of the organization. And it's very rare that you have business units who fall outside those legal and compliance obligations. And so someone in your organization really has to be the bridge builder between those different groups. And, the the challenge is to really help empower and equip those CISOs with the business context they need so that they can have those discussions both on the technical and business operational level when they are having these high level conversations with their C-suite, the executive leaders, the board. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen enough. And you had mentioned the dark triad personality types. Psychological safety is a huge element that I think compliance legal has not really focused on enough. The ability for people to have their voices heard, to know that they're in an environment where it is safe to disagree, where it is safe to raise these friction points and not have it adversely affect their next review, not pigeonhole them, not stick them in a box that no one wants to hear from. And I can say, coming from compliance, we're often seen as the Department of No, and people rarely want to hear from compliance. And shifting that perspective from the Department of No to the Department of How is one of those elements of psychological safety, because now I'm empowering the different business units to tell me what they actually are challenged with. Tell me about the technology debt that you've been accumulating. Talk to me about the engineering issues you have when you're ready to launch a product and legal says, no, we've got to hold for 2 months to do a thorough review. But I think your point about diverse leadership is also critical. You have to have the people that are willing to create that area and culture for discussions, for frank, honest discussions, not just hearing what ultimately the board wants to hear because everyone feels like they're beholden to what the top 1% of the organization thinks they need to hear.
Yeah, that's a much easier said than done. Because I know some exceptions. I know some organizations who have like anti-bullying practices and things like that, and they're going to go after people that might be problematic, and that's built into the culture and is built into the thinking. So I do know of organizations where things like that exist. However, if you get somebody who's like in the whistleblowing, they're oftentimes demonized for doing the whistleblowing. It's a big challenge for organizations. So I know somebody who was in a fiduciary pickle. I actually did a podcast with him that was just released last week. It'll be 2 or 3 weeks when this comes out. But one of the challenges he needed to re-report the same thing that the business had not taken action on from the quarter before. He reported it, and partially he became demonized simply as a result of reporting something that he had to do because he had a fiduciary duty. And that's very problematic, that whole psychological aspect of things. And that's something that I think that organizations need to be painfully aware of, is because all of these types of things can have a lot of influence. And they might think, hey, we're going into that theater side of things. Yes, you've got your whistleblower, but then if you're going to go after the whistleblower for saying something, then that really isn't a whistleblower policy. You are setting people up for failure as a result of the whistleblowing. And so when you talk about that, that takes a very rare type of leadership to start to bring in the right resources. And a lot of the right resources, the good things, can simultaneously be the bad things when you start to talk about characters like the Dark Triad. One of them, for people who are not aware, is Machiavellianism. Yes, that Machiavelli who wrote The Prince, but they um, have a whole concept where they like to manipulate people, and they're very good at doing so. And having sat in some of the rooms where I've had the meeting set up, you get HR and legal involved. Hey, somebody's a bad person. Who's likely to sue? The person who is attacked, or the person who's doing the attacking? Well, if you look at it from a legal risk standpoint, well, the person who is attacked is likely to sue. So you end up pushing them out or pushing them off to the side, and those kind of things happen. And it's very rational for the reason that I just cited. What are some mechanisms in place that you could see to start balancing things out? Because this stuff is very easy, and I've watched these kind of things happen in the past. What do you recommend for companies who are trying to challenge the status quo here?
I think the best thing that you can do is reframe what a whistleblower is. A whistleblower is someone that is sending a very important feedback signal to leadership that is saying, hey, I'm observing something that violates our doctrine, or it violates our stated policies and procedures, or violates our legal or regulatory requirements. Now, you are literally shooting the messenger if you attack the whistleblower. The whistleblower is there. The fact that they are reporting something, they're saying, hey, I know we can do better. We need to be doing better than what we are doing. There is a failure in our current mechanisms that is causing this deviation to occur. I'm the one who's stating that it's occurring, and hats off to those people, because they serve an incredibly useful function within an organization who is willing to put their reputation on the line and say, hey, we've got a problem, we need to address it. And I think that if you can rethink and reframe how we think about whistleblowers as a reflexive knee-jerk reaction, oh, this is a threat to the company, in terms of, no, this is an early warning signal. This is someone who has eyes on a process that is broken. And if we want to actually have resiliency within our organization, if we actually want to serve our shareholders appropriately, we need to fix this. Because it's a lot easier to fix this now rather than sweep it under the rug, and the next thing you know, you've got a $2,200,000 breach that you've got to deal with.
So I definitely agree with you, but I'd like to figure out how, if I can go down that particular route, because it's very easy to say that. But when you're talking about pure psychology, oh, I'm embarrassed because of X, Y, and Z, that becomes an impediment to doing the right thing. Everybody might know it's the right thing, but how many people are going to admit that it's the right thing? Because when you're looking at, hey, that could be a $2 million risk. Now, I know some companies that are very good. I've seen some cases that are legal that I can't speak about, that they've done the right thing. And I'm like, okay, wow, I really respect that company. But not all companies are behaving that way. And it's a real challenge to do that kind of thing. And we talk about those Dark Triad, more often than not, in companies that don't have good, strong practices to deal with the root of the problem, that becomes a problem, even for because it's just the psychology of people, that becomes an impediment. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
this is one of the reasons why I've started to develop my approach to governance in part around Toyota's and Accord. And for those who don't know, the Toyota implemented approach on their assembly lines, constant quality improvement mechanism called the Accord. And basically, it empowered any line worker on the assembly, if they notice a problem, to pull the cord. It shuts down the line automatically. And then people from management come, they inspect, they figure out what the problem is. They either restart, they escalate if necessary. And what they reframed it as is it's not a privilege to pull the cord. It's an obligation. It's where see something, say something actually means something. It's great to say, yeah, if you see things that are wrong, if you see things that violate our corporate culture or our company doctrine, yeah, definitely, let HR know or call this 800 line. But if that whistleblower has to do an internal risk rewards calculation, what is this going to cost me reputationally, career-wise, financially? Is it going to ruin my family? Is it going to blackball me from the industry? It's very difficult to find the people who are willing to pull the cord and say, hey, there's a problem here. We need to address it. And so it really is shifting how you see and the ROI of whistleblowers. So if you can reframe it as a positive value add to your organization, to have a culture of responsible whistleblowing. And yes, there are going to be petty people who abuse it, just like any system. And you'll have to deal with those people very harshly and concretely to say, hey, we have this system of reporting and whistleblowing in place for a specific reason, a doctrinal reason. We have an obligation to our customers. We have an obligation to our shareholders to treat whistleblowing and reporting as a signal on how to fix something internally before it becomes a cascading failure. So I think that is a huge part of helping companies recognize that a whistleblower in time saves 9. Let's not have those cascading failures. Let's not have the brand and reputational damage of a government investigation or a shareholder lawsuit or whatever, Wall Street Journal expose. Let's not have that. Let's fix these things internally. And you're going to get a more engaged, proactive culture who is not afraid of taking calculated risks that will then help the company advance. I think of someone like 3M. They developed sticky notes completely accidentally. And, if the people involved in figuring out how to create these new sticky notes were punished because they were going off task, 3M would be a very different looking company today. If Toyota didn't have its exacting quality standards that demanded line workers stop the entire production line until they could figure out how to solve the problems, Toyota would be and Lexus would be vastly different looking companies than they are today.
Sure. And I think it's a great goal. So I want to appreciate you bringing up Accord, because I think that's a really good example that our listeners and viewers can use to start to think about how do you build good corporate governance. And I think that it's a great goal that companies should strive for. There's definitely a lot of challenges, and it also means that people have to be ready for uncomfortable conversations, which not everybody is. And a lot of people, they don't want that uncomfortable conversation. When you're talking about an execution culture, it's very different. For like one of the examples that's out there quite a bit that has hit the news a lot is Boeing. That is a case where somebody decided, hey, let's go ahead and stop the line because I'm seeing too many problems, so many issues. They didn't do it, and it's hurt their bottom line.
Yeah,
you know.
and this is something that you've seen. I had a great conversation a few days ago with a wonderful guy. Name is Ken Larson. He does a lot of mentoring, has worked very deeply um, in defense contracting, Bronze Star veteran. Really, and I talked to him in anticipation of our conversation, and he shared a lot of conversations and a lot of war stories that he's seen, especially around defense contractors and where governance goes right, where it goes wrong. So, big shout out to him for a great conversation. And I think that CISOs are uniquely positioned to help push these doctrine discussions inside organizations, um, even with in a way that prevents it from just being another exercise. One of the key insights I've had from watching decades of governance succeed and fail across military and corporate environments is this: you have to make it about culture, not compliance. Every organization is unique. Communication, policy development, education, it has to be narrowly tailored, it has to be clear, and it has to be decisive. And this communication has to go both ways. And everyone from the janitor up to the CEO, they need reinforcement, they need constant mandatory training, and without training just becoming a checkbox, because that's even worse than no training. It creates the illusion of alignment without the reality. So my recommendations is CISOs should push doctrine by asking one question in every strategic meeting: what do we believe about risk? Not what is our risk register, not are we compliant with SOC 2, but what do we actually believe about risk? Do we believe that speed is worth risking data exposure? Do we believe that customer friction is worse than a breach? Do we believe that our competitors' CISO is as underfunded as ours? These are doctrinal questions. And the moment you surface them, you've moved the conversation from compliance, which we all know is boring and it loses budget fights.
I actually like compliance, and actually I've
Well,
seen it win, sometimes lose, but
overall, it's not the shiny thing.
yeah.
When you move it to a competitive strategy, that's what really interests and piques the attention of your CEOs and your board members, and can really help to win them over. So as a 0481 landing support specialist, I didn't persuade commanders to care about logistics by quoting throughput regulations. I showed them that bad logistics doctrine meant their Marines didn't get ammunition on time.
Sure.
You make the consequences real, and the doctrine stops being a policy exercise.
Sure. So let's start to move towards wrapping up here in a little bit, but I've got a couple more questions to kind of move down,
Sure.
because everybody knows that there's no such thing as perfection. If there were, nobody would have a job. You're in a situation where you've got challenges, you've got hackers coming in, you got all these kinds of things. But more often than not, doctrine is not explicitly sought within organizations. How is it that a CISO, by him or herself, can start to get that conversation going, other than like basic risk appetite and tolerance, which I think everybody, most of the listeners here are aware of? What are your recommendations to start to change that culture, to change that doctrine, and start moving in a better direction? Because you start mentioning any type of new document, most people like, oh, it's a waste of time. It's going to be never ending. It's going to be, insert 1,000 different reasons here. So talk to me a little bit about what your thoughts are along those routes. How can a CISO improve the world around them?
The first thing I would do is to surround yourself with like-minded individuals in your organization. um, cross those business unit silos. Reach out to people who are really interested in this kind of systems-wide, ground-up cultural synthesis. And those are going to be great people to use as sounding boards, to have these conversations, and to find your internal alignment amongst your fellow champions before you try going to your C-suite or your board with the idea. I think that's fundamental, because once you start breaking down those silos, immediately you're going to start feeling better that you're not the only one in the organization who sees these issues. You're not the only one who has to figure this out on your own. That there are allies and champions within your organization if you're willing to look for them and find them and have these uncomfortable conversations. These are not fun conversations to have. They're challenging, they're tough, but when done right, they're extremely rewarding for the organization as a whole. And I think that if I could put myself in the role of a CISO and make only one belief explicit tomorrow, which cybersecurity doctrine would have the highest leverage throughout the organization? Again, it would be to make the organization's risk appetite explicit and documented. That's it. Most cybersecurity systems conflicts stem from unstated, incompatible risk tolerances. For example, the board says, we accept X risk in exchange for Y speed. That's doctrine. It forces honesty. It means that the CISO is no longer the lone voice of caution getting overruled in every meeting. The board has already stated what it's willing to lose, and now the CISO's job is to hold the organization accountable to its own stated beliefs. That's the commander's intent. They have stated their intent. Now it's the CISO's job to hold the organization within their organizational role accountable. And, you know, in the procurement world, programs that succeeded weren't the ones with the most rules.
If I can jump in here a little bit,
yes.
because I love what you're saying, and I agree with it on many fronts. The challenge is, and I've seen this case over and over and over again, it's sort of a repetitive epic that I think a lot of cybersecurity leaders talk about. You know, it kind of goes back to the person that I talked about it from the podcast 3 weeks ago. You know, if you are speaking up and other people who are above you, they don't like that, you know, and that becomes a psychological barrier. So you've got a organizational chart challenge with dealing with those types of things. Because I agree with you. To me, any sort of criticism is a blessing. You should take it as a blessing. You should sit down and really listen and have a conversation with it. I am 100% on your side. However, most human psychology, they tend not to like those kind of things, especially if you're calling them out to the board of directors, and it makes them look bad. You know, it kind of goes back to that old concept from Japan of saving face. Are you helping somebody save face? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? For those who are not familiar, you don't make people look bad, so you take the ownership of that. That's part of what a good leader does is, hey, that's my fault. I will work on it. And people know you didn't actually create the problem and it was somebody else on the team, but you take the ownership of that. You're helping them save face. But that's a big challenge when you're dealing with these fiduciary requirements. You've got a conflict of interest that goes on. Like, let me give you an example. I had met one CIO. He had jumped into a new job. There was a chief information security officer that was already in the role. And the CIO, being new to it, walked over to the CISO and said, so tell us about our vulnerability status. And I think everybody knows here, there's always going to be vulnerabilities. There's no such thing as no vulnerabilities in an organization. And the way the CISO responded from what the CIO said, we don't have any vulnerabilities. you know, the CISO had freaked out. That is a trauma response that's occurring as a result of that conversation. That CISO was freaked out and probably went through a lot of bad stuff with the previous CIO. And therefore, he was still kind of living in that reality when he was in a new one. And so things like that become real challenges to work through. And that's where I think a lot of this stuff is very interesting. The goals are there, but I think we also have to work around and within and create organizations around some of those common friction points because we don't want any more CISOs to go through what that particular CISO went through. I can only imagine what happened to him, but that's a big challenge. Do you see any ways of handling those types of contexts?
I think that the first advice that had that CIO come to me and said, I'm new in this role. I want to find out about our security vulnerabilities. How should I approach it? My instinct, my response to him would be to ask questions around it, not go right to the meat of the matter. Questions like, what kind of challenges are you seeing with our risk posture? What are some of the friction points you've noticed? You have to build up the trust and the rapport first. And this goes bridging silos. This is talking to your board. 3:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning in the middle of a cyber incident is not the time to start building up trust and rapport. That's the time for execution. If you're having to build up trust at that point, you've failed in your communication efforts and your training efforts
Right.
beforehand.
But this was like a new conversation. As you said, be indirect and not direct. Because you're right, because by asking the risk appetite question, you're being indirect, but you're still getting a sense of, are we aligned with doctrine? And what's so interesting about that is I would say there's a growing movement that's out there that's trying to change things along this front, but that is not the typical route that most companies are trying to work towards, and most CISOs are not focusing on. And it does
that's
take
a real challenge on how the cyber world has operated in the past 15, 20 years. That it has been very much isolated and very much just relegated to its purely technical role. And it's very recent that CISOs are now expected to have these board level conversations, to have these executive level conversations, to sign off on actual regulatory and compliance issues, not just maintain servers and networks and cybersecurity. And so I think that there's a lot of soft skills that cybersecurity experts have not traditionally been equipped with that is going to be a requirement going forward. And I understand very much, coming from Silicon Valley, that very pure, unadulterated tech mentality. I get that. But that is always going to be a friction point when you are trying to bridge gaps with business and operations. And so even if you are not personally feel yourself capable, but reach out to other people in your organization. Try to develop relationships with your compliance people, because they are aligned and parallel on the tracks that you're working on. They just come at it from a different discipline. I myself started going to things like RSAC and hackathons to really understand how the IT, how the cyber folks I work with actually see the world through their own prism, through their own environment. Because I can't assume that they're going to be able to communicate their needs to me or to anyone else if I don't take the step to bridge those communication gaps myself. And really, circling back, it's a risk reward question you have to ask yourself to have these conversations. You have to understand the culture of the company. Is this company open to what I'm proposing? Do our values align? If not, do I want to stay here anyway? Do I want to continue this role? The CISO burnout is real, and it's a
Oh yeah.
tough spot. And I don't envy the requirements and demands, and I can understand why so many people are moving to a fractional model of saying, hey, I only want to work with companies that I'm aligned with. If our values, if our methodologies mesh, then I'm more than happy to work with you. If they don't, well, then you've got to make a calculated decision on what your personal boundaries are and how far you're willing to stick your neck out. It's not a glamorous thing. It's really scary sometimes to be that person shouting into the wind about your cyber risks. And not every board, not every executive is going to be receptive.
Yeah. And
So
that's so true. I mean, another story that I've heard working with somebody, the CISO finally made the arguments to report into the business. They were out there. They didn't have the emotional intelligence or the awareness to try to deal with and listen to the business first, start shouting, critical risk, we aren't doing things. They fired him and said, we are never having another CISO reporting into a CEO again. That's entirely going to be reporting into the CIO because we need some sanity. And that's a case where the doctrine was locked in at that particular point because of the damage of one person. So it's like they learned their lesson, and it's definitely a big challenge in places like that. So, but I want to thank you very much. I think this has been a very enlightening conversation. I'm hoping that everybody got a lot out of this particular conversation because doctrine, I think, really does need to be discussed more, and needs to be discussed at a very deep level so that people understand how important it is, because that's that subtext that a lot of people don't often surface, and those assumptions need to be talked about and worked through. Sometimes you're more on the same page than not. You just have a communication gap. So thank you very much. Any last minute thoughts you'd like to impart to our watchers?
just again, I want to, encourage people to truly understand what your organization's risk appetite is, truly understand where you have like-minded individuals in your organization, and you really can transform your organization through doctrine if everyone has a common aligned purpose and is willing to do the work.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's greatly appreciated. Good
Thank you,
night, everybody.
Matthew.
Bye-bye.